welcome back to my channel. So if you haven't noticed, which I'm sure you have at this point, today's not a missing persons case. I'm actually taking things way back to my roots over a year ago, and I am doing a solved case, which I know was my most popular mini-series that I did. So I definitely want to start throwing in more videos like this. I love doing missing persons cases, but every once in a while I really get an itch to do something different, whether that's solved no body, a Jane or a John Doe, a serial killer. I really just want to start adding in at least once a month something a little bit different for you guys, because I know solved is a great break for everybody in a sense of there is some closure to the case, and there's definitely a huge way you can still impact the case by spreading awareness, especially for cases like today, which is technically solved, but there is no body. So I first heard of this case through one of my podcasts, and something about it just stuck out to me so hard. And I'm not sure if it's because it reminds me a lot of myself when I was younger, and I know a lot of you guys will probably be able to relate to this, but there's just something about everyone involved, and the fact that there is kind of a resolution, but there's still a lot of missing answers. So let's just go ahead and jump right on into today's case, and that is the case of Kiplyn Davis. Kiplyn was 15 years old when she disappeared from her Spanish Fork High School in Utah on May 2nd of 1995. Kiplyn was known to be so incredibly bubbly and happy and the life of the party. You never saw her upset, you never saw her sad, and it seemed like her goal was to be friends with absolutely everybody. It was a rainy day in Spanish Fork, Utah when Kiplyn was supposed to wake up at about 4:30 in the morning. And if you remember being 15 years old, it was hard enough to wake up at like 7 for me to get to school. So waking up at 4:30 in the morning was crazy, but she did it for a reason. She had driver's ed classes before school, so she had to wake up early to go to these driver's ed classes, and she didn't mind because she was so ready to get her driver's license. But on this particular morning, Kiplyn was having a very difficult time waking up and kept hitting her snooze button and kept falling back asleep. And at around 5 a.m. when her dad realized she wasn't awake, he went in to wake her up, and she realized at this point what she had pretty much done. Now, Kiplyn, again, was in those younger teenage years where she was very, very concerned about her appearance and, you know, being able to get ready and doing things when she wanted, how she wanted, right when she wanted it. And she was not happy that she woke up late and didn't have time to get herself together and do her makeup and do her hair and fully get ready. So she begged her dad and her mom, Richard and Tamara, to please let her skip this driver's ed class. She figured she was going to be late anyways and it wouldn't really matter, but they knew how badly she wanted to get her driver's license, so they told her no. Kiplyn then angrily stormed outside to where her mom was waiting to drive her to school, and she was crying and she was so upset. You know, she felt like she wasn't ready for the day, and she was so mad at her parents for not letting her just stay home in bed for a little bit longer. But by the end of the drive, she was pretty much fine. You know, when you're a young teenager, every possible event in your life is the most dramatic it can possibly be, but usually you bounce back fairly quickly. So by the time she got to school for her driver's ed class, everything was fine. Both Kiplyn's mom and dad continued on going to work, and Kiplyn continued on going to all of her morning classes. Richard, Kiplyn's father, got home a little bit after 3:30 and expected Kiplyn to be there. Kiplyn wasn't there, so he assumed maybe she had to do something, stay behind at school. She was a part of the drama club. It's very possible something came up, so he checked the voicemails to see if she had called from school to say where she was. But instead of getting a voicemail from Kiplyn, he received a voicemail from the school to let him know that Kiplyn had never shown up to her 4th or her 5th period. This was very confusing and unsettling for Richard and his wife once he got a hold of her, because both Richard and Tamara had cell phones, and if Kiplyn was going to do anything or going to go anywhere, or if there was some sort of emergency at school, like she was sick or anything like that, she would always call their cell phone. So the fact that she left school without telling anyone didn't quite sit right with them, but they brought their minds back to that morning, and they wondered if maybe Kiplyn was just very upset still, a lot more upset than they originally had thought from the fight that morning. It's very possible she went to school, started talking to her friends about it, and got worked up all over again and decided to have a little bit of teenage rebellion and skip classes, and then maybe show up home a little bit later to get back at her parents. So they decided to wait for a little bit to see if that would happen, but by 5 p.m. Kiplyn still hadn't shown up, and because she was so like clockwork and always on time, even when she was angry, they decided they were going to try to start searching for her. They started calling every single one of Kiplyn's friends, but not a single one of them had seen her since around lunchtime that day. And Kiplyn hadn't told anyone she was leaving school. Kiplyn hadn't left with anyone in particular. So all these friends that usually should know where their other friend is while at school seem to have no idea what happened to her. So by 7 p.m., Richard and Tamara decided to drive to the school themselves, wondering if maybe she really was at school like they thought, and she just somehow got stuck there or left there or just, kind of blanked out and just didn't call or tell anyone. But they showed up to the school and they couldn't find her anywhere. After going to the school, they decided to go to Kiplyn's church because Kiplyn was very, very active in her church. So they assumed maybe she was mad, but she really just wanted to go somewhere safe to blow off some steam. But when they got to the church, Kiplyn wasn't there either, and nobody had seen her all day long. So this is when they decided to call authorities. Unfortunately, given the circumstances of the fight earlier that morning and Kiplyn skipping school and the typical idea that comes along with teenagers that act this way, authorities right off the bat just assumed Kiplyn was a runaway. But Kiplyn's parents strongly disagreed with this. Despite the argument that they had, it was not like her to just not come home. They had been in many arguments just like this before over something very small and minuscule and unimportant, but she still always came home, and she had a lot going on in her life that was very positive. And even if she had run off for a little bit, she would have eventually come back, more than likely that day, because she had driver's ed. She was so looking forward to getting her license. One of her older sisters was about to get married, and by all accounts, she was a very happy girl. It just wouldn't make sense for her to want to run away. Authorities didn't do much at all at first, again, because when they assume someone is a runaway, they also assume this person will eventually come back, and if they don't, then they can finally start searching. So Kiplyn's parents were left to search for her on their own. So the only other thing they could do was just keep calling friends, because someone at this school had to have known where Kiplyn went or who Kiplyn might have been with. So they started calling friends again and then getting numbers for other friends who gave numbers for other acquaintances, and they started this giant chain of phone calls which eventually landed them on a young man named Eli. And Eli had an interesting bit of information. So Eli claims that during lunch, when Kiplyn had eaten lunch with her friends, right after that he saw Kiplyn talking to a man named Chris Jepson. Kiplyn and Chris were in the drama club together, so they did have a class together, they did spend a decent amount of time together, but Eli told Kiplyn's parents that he was not a big fan of Chris because Chris was not a good guy. But little did Eli know, this was not the first time that Kiplyn's parents had heard the name Chris Jepson. So in their frantic search while looking for anything they could that would give a clue as to where Kiplyn went, they stumbled across her diary and found a more recent diary entry where Kiplyn admitted to having this massive crush on Chris, and she had kissed him and hugged him, but Kiplyn was not allowed to date boys until she was 16 years old. So her parents at this point thought, wow, maybe she's over at Chris's house dating someone behind our backs. So immediately they left and went over to Chris's house and knocked on the door, and the only person there was Chris's sister. And they said, have you seen him? Have you seen Kiplyn? And she definitely hadn't seen Kiplyn, but she had seen Chris before school. But according to her, he had not come home yet, and based off of her assumptions, he likely was still at the school because he worked really odd hours there as a drama tech. So he would set up the stage, get different props out, change out lights, string up lights, get everything for plays and different performances ready. So usually he would be at the school working until about 10 p.m. at night if there was a performance coming. And despite the fact that both Richard and Tamara had already gone to the school and not found Kiplyn or Chris anywhere, they drove all the way back to the school to search again. But when they got there, it was already about 10 p.m. and all the doors were locked up tight. All of the lights were off. There weren't any cars or anything in the parking lot. So now the story was getting even more strange. So the last person that was seen with Kiplyn, according to Eli, was this guy named Chris. And then Kiplyn goes missing. And then at the same time, once they lead everything back to Chris, now Chris can't be found anywhere. So they wonder if maybe Chris and Kiplyn are off somewhere together and decide to go all the way back to Chris's house again to see if maybe he came back, or maybe if they had heard from him or have any sort of other answers, hopefully now that the parents more than likely would be home. At this point, when Richard gets back to Chris's house, it's after midnight. But when he gets there, he sees more cars than he saw before, and he definitely saw a light on the inside. So someone was home, and the car that he saw in the driveway was one that he recognized, and this car belonged to a former student at Spanish Fork High School named Rucker Leifson. So if Rucker was there, Rucker was friends with Chris, and it was Chris's house, so obviously Chris had to be there. So now, not only was Kiplyn possibly with Chris, who she confessed to having a crush on, they were also pretty sure Rucker at some point while he was still going to school there had asked Kiplyn out on a date as well. So these two young men that both seemed to be interested in Kiplyn were now together after Chris was the last one to supposedly see her. So this was becoming a very confusing, tangled web of questions for both Richard and Tamara. For some reason, Richard never went up to the door to see if they had any answers, and he chalks it up to the fact that it was after midnight, and even though there was a light on, he didn't want to be rude. The next morning, Richard and Tamara wake up, and Kiplyn is still nowhere to be found, and no one can get in contact with her. And then when she didn't show up to her driver's ed class or school that day, the school started to really crack down on the students because it was the last place that she had been seen. So around 7:30 a.m., the school started making announcements going around class to class personally, saying that if anyone had seen Kiplyn or heard from Kiplyn, if they'd heard a rumor about where she might have gone, if there was any sort of talk, to come forward because nobody could locate her. They then went to the last people she was known to be with or have talked to, and they started questioning them as well. And Chris was the very first person that they decided to question. Chris didn't seem nervous about being questioned. He didn't seem guilty of anything, and he was very open with authorities. He told them that he had seen Kiplyn that day at lunch, just like Eli had said, but that after that, he didn't see Kiplyn again. And then he said that he went through classes the rest of the day and then stayed to set up for a play and string lights up in the auditorium until around 11 p.m. that night. But he wasn't alone. He said that he had his friend Rucker and his friend Tim with him. He said that they all were helping each other string these lights up. They were throwing a football around, listening to music, just kind of hanging out in the auditorium for most of the night until they left. This kind of explained the fact that the school appeared to be locked up at around 10 p.m. because he had a key to the school because of his odd hours. So obviously, to keep him and his friends safe, he locked the door behind him, and it by all means looked like the school was all locked up and shut down. But authorities wanted to verify this information because, again, Chris was the last person to have seen Kiplyn. So they went to both Tim and Rucker, and both young men had the exact same story about going to the auditorium, stringing up lights, playing with a football, and leaving at 11 p.m. So authorities decided they wanted to start digging around somewhere else to see if they could shake loose any more answers. Pretty quickly, they found someone else who had a highly suspicious story. So Kiplyn also knew a young man named Brandon, and despite the fact that she wasn't allowed to date, Brandon had approached her that day and asked her out on a date, and Kiplyn had said yes. But very shortly after this, and conveniently right around lunchtime, right before Kiplyn disappeared, Brandon approached Kiplyn again and said that he actually had been dating another girl, and the other girl found out that he asked Kiplyn on a date and was angry, so he had to cancel. So they went to double check as much of this information as they could and do all the typical background things they would while looking into someone, and found even more interesting information. That just like Kiplyn, Brandon had missed his 4th and 5th periods. So they wondered if maybe Brandon was upset and mad that he couldn't take Kiplyn out on a date because of this girl, so him and Kiplyn decided to just skip class and run away for their own date without anybody knowing. So they went back to Brandon and asked him all these questions and confronted him with this information, but he had a story and an alibi to go along with it. He told authorities that he felt so incredibly bad about having to cancel his date with Kiplyn because she was pretty upset about it, that he tried to find her right after lunch, but he couldn't find her anywhere, and because he was already late for his next class, he decided to just go ahead and skip school. But he said he had a way to prove this, because while he was on his way home, he actually ended up getting a flat tire and had to call one of his very best friends to help him come and change it. So this seemed to check out perfect. This made perfect sense. It didn't answer anything about Kiplyn, but it definitely made Brandon's story look less suspicious. That is until they went to the friend who said that none of that ever happened and he never helped Brandon change a tire. While this was incredibly suspicious, they had nothing else to go off of. There was no evidence that said foul play happened to Kiplyn. There is no evidence that they left together. There was nothing they could go off of, and these were minors. These were high school students. So at this point, they had to basically let everything sit and just hope someone came forward out of guilt or someone really just wanted to go ahead and start telling the truth. A few sightings started coming in from people that Kiplyn was seen on Main Street sometime after her lunch period that day, which just really suggested the idea that she had just left and run off out of anger, but they weren't able to confirm any of these sightings. There was also someone that came forward claiming to have seen Kiplyn between 4th and 5th period, meaning that she came back to the school at some point, but then this same person came forward later on and completely took back what they said, saying it wasn't true. It was also found in the search of the school that Kiplyn had left all of her belongings, her purse, absolutely everything, in her locker, which really suggested to authorities and her family that she intended to come back, but something stopped that from happening. So after months of this seeming like a potential runaway situation, the longer it passed that Kiplyn never came home, authorities really started to believe that foul play was absolutely involved. And to add fuel to that fire, rumors had started going around the town and the school that Kiplyn had been sexually assaulted, killed, and then buried in the local canyon. So authorities really started digging deeper into every potential person that could have been with her that day, including Tim, Rucker, and Chris. The boys stuck to their story. They would not change anything up. They swore up and down this is what they were doing. They were in the auditorium. They were together. They never saw Kiplyn after lunch. But then Chris did something that no one really expected. A year after Kiplyn went missing, Chris showed up on the Davis doorstep, and he said he had to get something off of his chest. And at this point, Richard is having an absolute meltdown because he thinks that Chris is about to say, I did something to her, or I know what happened to her. But instead, all Chris says is, I didn't do anything to Kiplyn. And this puts up a giant red flag for Richard. He said there's no way you would come all the way here a year later to get something off your chest to just tell me you didn't do anything. So he really started going in on Chris, saying, what did you do to her? You know something, you know what happened to her. And it flustered Chris so much and he got so panicked and freaked out that he just left. Richard was so shaken up by this odd encounter with Chris that he went and told authorities about it, and they also agreed that this was very bizarre. So they decided to bring each young man in for questioning and to take a polygraph. And this also totally changed circumstances in this case. So they again expected everyone to come in, these three young men, and say the same thing they had said hundreds of times. But when Tim started to write his statement, he gave a completely different story than what he had been giving them the entire past year. He said that he went with Rucker and Kiplyn that day after everyone left school after lunch to the canyon, the local canyon. And he said that when they got there, Kiplyn and Rucker somehow wandered off on their own. He said that when they got there after a while, Kiplyn and Rucker walked off on their own, and then Rucker came back by himself, and Kiplyn was nowhere to be found. Authorities were astounded. Their jaws dropped to the floor because they thought they finally were getting somewhere. But once they started questioning the story and putting pressure on Tim, Tim freaked out, crumpled up his paper, threw it in the trash, and went back to his original story. But authorities still had something. They still had the polygraph test left to do. So they took this information and used it in the polygraph test, expecting either Rucker or possibly Chris to know something about this, or Rucker possibly being involved, and for him to fail the polygraph test. But to their shock, every single one of them passed with flying colors. So now it was all the way back to square one. They didn't want to take any of this information lightly, despite the fact that all the polygraph tests had technically been passed, but we know how unreliable polygraph tests can be. So they decided to take search teams and dog teams all up into the canyon, but absolutely nothing was found. More searches were done and more years passed. The boys kept their same story and grew into men, and the Davis family was still left without knowing what happened to their daughter. So they really decided to put in this last effort to have something done about their daughter, and the fact that Tim had tried to admit to something and then took it all back. So the Davis family started desperately writing to everyone they possibly could so that all of this information could be put in front of a grand jury. And it worked. They hoped that the seriousness of the trial and, the consequences of lying to a grand jury, and the fact that they all had families, they all had, I think, children for the most part, they hoped that all of this together would lead one of them to finally confess to something. It took 2 whole years for all of the testimonies against these young men in regards to Kiplyn's disappearance and assumed death. People were coming forward out of the woodworks to throw every single one of these young men under the bus. I'm not just talking a few, I mean dozens of these young men's friends from high school and just acquaintances or people that they had partied with. 2 people in specific had been at a party with Tim when something came on the TV reminding everyone about Kiplyn's disappearance, and Tim snapped and said that he knew where she was and she deserved what happened to her. Then even more disturbing, Chris's wife came forward and she said that one night her and Chris were having one of their typical movie nights and they were watching So I Married an Axe Murderer, and she turned to Chris in like a joking way and said, "Hey, what's the worst thing you've ever done? If you tell me, I'll tell you the worst thing I've ever done." And he looked her dead in the face and said, "What if I told you I murdered Kiplyn Davis?" Of course, after that, when she looked mortified of what her husband just said, he said, "Oh, this is just a big joke. I was messing around with you. I just wanted to scare you." But she said it stuck in her mind so much that she questioned it for years. Information also came forward that after Tim had basically thrown Rucker under the bus when they were all putting in their statements and having their polygraph test done, that Rucker came to Tim and threatened to kill him if he ever put his name in connection with Kiplyn Davis ever again. But the one thing that really dismantled every single one of their stories was new information that they found that I have no idea how it took this long for someone to notice. The auditorium that they claimed to be in that night, all night long, for hours and hours, throwing footballs, playing music, stringing up lights until 11 p.m., had been used for a choir performance that night. So there wasn't even any way this alibi ever would have checked out, because the auditorium was in use. They couldn't have been in there doing these things. After having to sit through all of these different testimonies from dozens and dozens of people that knew Kiplyn, that knew Chris, Rucker, and Tim, the family at this point decided there was no way Kiplyn was alive, and they decided to go ahead and declare Kiplyn dead. And they made the date May 2nd, 1995, and they put up a beautiful headstone for her so that when they finally were able to find her, they could bring her home and bury her properly. Unfortunately, after this entire grand jury experience, what they hoped happened didn't necessarily happen. The men stuck with their stories. Tim refused to say what he had said previously in the interview, and they didn't really have any new information coming straight from the men themselves. But the one thing they did have was enough for the grand jury to charge them with perjury. They were sitting there claiming their innocence for 2+ years while all these friends that knew them brought forward these insane stories of them admitting to killing Kiplyn. So the judge himself even believed they were completely lying and hiding information. Tim ended up getting 12 years in prison for perjury. Chris got 5 years in prison for perjury and Rucker got 4. Tim got so much more because apparently most of the testimonies were directed right at him, which no one really expected. Everyone thought everything was going to go straight to Chris. So that's why he got more time than everybody else. I think he has a record of holding the highest amount of time in prison for perjury. I think they had 15 separate counts on him. And while this seemed like a defeat because it didn't really do anything for Kiplyn herself and they didn't get any new information on the case, what it did allow was for the state to finally feel comfortable enough to charge for her murder. They thought, along with this perjury and all these different testimonies and everything in that sense being so successful in front of a grand jury, they definitely thought they had a chance. So Chris and Tim were both charged with Kiplyn Davis's murder. And this just kept dragging up more information that these men had told people. More people just kept coming forward to testify. More people remember strange experiences. And then even Tim's sister herself testified against him. She said that he had an issue with lying and she wasn't sure if she believed him. So even parts of the family started turning on these men. And then in 2011, Tim pleaded guilty to manslaughter and he finally brought forward a story of what he saw happen to Kiplyn Davis. So he claimed that him and another unnamed person went with Kiplyn to the canyon. So just like the story he had originally told authorities a year after Kiplyn went missing. He said that him and this unnamed person and Kiplyn went up to the canyon and Kiplyn and this person disappeared off by themselves. And after about 30 to 45 minutes, Tim went to find them. So this tells me quite a few things. This unnamed person, first of all, I find it interesting that Tim had named this person as Rucker before, and then after Rucker threatened to kill him, Tim suddenly shut down and wouldn't name this person. So I strongly believe, as well as authorities and family, they have all openly stated they believe this unnamed person is Rucker. I also think, according to this, that maybe Tim was giving Rucker and Kiplyn a chance to maybe go off and do their own intimate thing. So I think that's why he waited 30 to 45 minutes to go off and search for Kiplyn. So he said that after this unnamed person and Kiplyn didn't come back, he went to go and look for them. And when he got to their location, this unnamed person hit Kiplyn over the right side of her head with a rock. And she immediately fell to the ground where this unnamed person again hit her. So Tim said he ran up to ask what the heck was going on, and this person said, just please help me. I need you to help me get her to the trees. So they drug her body over to a tree line where they hid her and then left. And at this point, Tim said he had no idea if she was dead or if she was just unconscious. So after a few hours, they came back to where they had put Kiplyn, and at this point, they were 100% certain that she was no longer living, so they then went and they buried her. Tim would not say who this other person was, and Tim would also not tell authorities where her body was buried. So this did lead to a whole lot of answers, but then a whole other load of questions. Chris ended up pleading no contest and settled for a lesser crime of obstruction of justice. So technically at this point, Tim was the only person charged with manslaughter or any sort of connection with the murder of Kiplyn Davis. As I said, authorities, the family, everyone possible in the community believes this unnamed person was Rucker for multiple different reasons. But unfortunately, no charges can be made, and I think they're trying to find more evidence in hopes of, possibly charging Rucker, but because he's a convicted perjurer, he's also seen as an unreliable witness. So basically, even if they kind of wanted to charge him or found enough, because of his previous perjury charges, he likely wouldn't even be able to successfully be tried. 2 other people, I think only one of them was technically a student at Spanish Fork High School, but Gary Blackmore and Scott Brunson were also charged with perjury. I wasn't able to find a lot of information on how exactly they were connected, but either way, 5 men in total were charged for lying to a grand jury and authorities about their whereabouts on the day Kiplyn Davis went missing and their knowledge on what happened to Kiplyn. So this is a giant group with a ton of big secrets. Tim is up for parole in 2021, which is disgustingly too soon if you ask me, But the Davis family says that they are going to do everything in their power to prevent that. They do not want him getting out because they swear he has information. It has been a long journey for them because Richard spent so much time afterwards trying to get the truth out of Tim and trying to find his daughter. He said he put his family on the back burner, he put the church on the back burner, and he really was just going so hard that he was forgetting everybody else. He was sending Tim letter after letter after letter telling him he wanted him to just say where the body was. He wanted him to tell who this unnamed person was. There was even a point where Tim led authorities to the body, but basically it was one giant charade. It just seems like they're willing to admit something happened, at least Tim is, but any other detail they want to not come out for some strange reason, which makes me wonder if, you know, they're claiming it was this accident because there's no proof. That's their best way of getting off. So what if they don't want this unnamed person being named, because then this unnamed person might also throw everyone else under the bus out of anger? And what if they don't want to say where the body is because when the body is found, it will be very obvious this wasn't just some random occurrence, but possibly a group effort? You know, I feel like there's definitely something to the fact that after all this time, no one will say a word. Tim literally has spent years and years and years in prison and still refuses to rat out any of these men. And on top of that, every single one of them, all 5 of these men, were given outstanding plea deals if they would just tell them where the body was. And the fact that none of them took these pleas, all of them would rather plead guilty, there's something much deeper going on in my personal opinion. But my personal opinion doesn't matter because Richard and Tamara at this point said that they just want to bring her home. They're not looking for more charges. They're not looking for more answers. They're not looking for any of that. They just want to be able to bury Kiplyn. Ever since the night that Kiplyn didn't come home, they have left their front porch light on. To this day, there has not been a night where that front porch light hasn't been on. And they said the only thing that will take that porch light and turn it off is them being able to put Kiplyn to rest. Because to them, they said, she's still searching for her home. She's out there cold and lost and confused, and they don't ever want to give up that possibility that they can bring her home. Despite knowing she is deceased, despite knowing there is no bringing her home in a sense of her being alive, they want her to be where she's supposed to be. They want her to be laid to rest with people that care for her and not buried out in the middle of a canyon by men that sexually assaulted and then killed her. Kiplyn's little sister, Carissa Lord, still runs her Facebook page, and she uses it to post memories about Kiplyn and to keep raising awareness because she strongly believes enough shaking will finally bring someone forward that knows exactly where Kiplyn is. I can't imagine how frustrating it would be to want answers for 10 years and then to finally get answers, except not all of them, you know. And I'm sure when you know at this point someone's done something to your daughter, obviously you want justice, you're going to be angry. But I feel like everyone's end goal and their biggest want and need would be to find the body and bring their loved one home and bury them. And so while I'm sure the charge is being made and justice being brought in a sense as best as authorities could do that for them, I'm sure that did bring relief for their family, but there will never be full relief until Kiplyn is brought home. And I strongly, strongly believe that eventually one of these men will crack, and I do believe it's going to be Tim, and I think he owes it to everybody. You know, clearly this is something that's on his mind that is bothering him. Clearly he knows what happens. He might have just witnessed something so brutal, so I don't know why he won't take the time to at least give the family their daughter. Like, what is the reason for wanting to keep this girl away from them? I do not understand it. It just hit so deep, such a bad nerve, and I feel so horribly for Kiplyn's family. It's just so frustrating, and I could not wait to share this story with you guys because I feel like it hits on so many different points of just making sure you are personally safe. Be careful who you trust. If you are a young woman or a young man, be careful putting yourself out there and going into, very secluded and potentially dangerous situations with someone else. Just please be aware of your surroundings. Make sure someone always knows where you are. And for everyone who's younger out there, this is a prime example of your parents just love you and they just want you to be safe. While there are rules that might seem annoying and weird to you, like you can't date until this age or you can't do this or can't do that, while they seem annoying and inconvenient and like they're taking away your freedom, it's because they love you and they want to keep you safe from things like this. There's just a lot to think about in this case, and I hope one of you walks away with at least some sort of lesson learned from this. And again, I hope one of these men finally cracks. But that's going to be it for today, you guys. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to Kiplyn's story. What I want to ask of you guys is to leave something kind for Kiplyn, for Kiplyn's family, down in the comments below. I don't want to see theories or hateful thing towards these men because they've held so much power, and still, unfortunately, because they won't give up her location, they're still holding on to power, and I don't want to feed them any more of it for a single second. So I want, if any of them somehow stumble across this video, I want them to see how many people care about Kiplyn and the family, so that maybe they think twice about what they've done and what they're deciding to keep to themselves, and so that Kiplyn's family knows that people still care and people still want them to get their daughter home, whatever that might take. I'm gonna go ahead and go now, you guys. I can't wait to see the sweet things you guys leave in the comment section because I know you guys are amazing and will absolutely blow this out of the water. On that note, don't forget to hit the subscribe button to become a member of the Howlin' fam, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.